Hey everyone, so I'm going to talk today about evolution and biodiversity. So the first thing that I want to talk about is basically, what is biodiversity? Alright, so biodiversity it's basically all the species on Earth. And they've discovered that there are approximately 20 million species on Earth. The reason that they keep discovering new ones is due to advances in like genetic testing and stuff like that. So species that they used to think were one species now are getting split into two and stuff like that. So we can measure biodiversity using species richness. Alright, so species richness, what is that? Species richness is basically how many species are there in an ecosystem. Alright, so if I were going to go out to like a forest or something like that, and I would just count the number of species that I find, that would be species richness. We can also do species evenness. Alright, and species evenness is, does one species dominate, or are all species represented evenly? Alright, so for example, let's say that I go out to the forest that's kind of behind the school, and I measure there are 10 oak trees, 10 beech trees, 10 pine trees. That would be a pretty even distribution of species. But if I go out there and there's 50 oak trees and there's like one pine tree and then there's one spruce, then that's not really evenly distributed. Alright, so we're talking about species richness and species evenness. You can measure species richness using this thing called the Shannon Index, which we're not going to do. And species evenness you can usually measure by, just taking a proportion of each species. So 10 out of the total number of species, or 20 out of the total number of species, what is that as a percentage? Alright, so evolution, in its most simplest form, is change over time. Alright, so individuals do not evolve, they adapt. So let's say that we've got a certain species that lives in a certain area, and then for some reason their environment changes. The individuals can do one of two things. One, they can either adapt or they can die. And if they adapt, then those that are able to adapt will be more likely to pass on their genes, and then eventually most of the population will look like the new adaptation. So populations evolve over time. And remember, populations change over time. So individuals do not evolve, they adapt, populations evolve. Alright, so let's talk about this guy. His name is Charles Darwin. I hope you've heard of Charles Darwin before. So let me change colors real quick. Alright, so let's talk about this guy named Charles Darwin. Alright, so Charles Darwin was riding on a boat. It was called the HMS Her Majesty's Service, the Beagle. And he stopped in the Galapagos Islands, and he was like a naturalist that was studying different types of species and stuff like that. So Charles Darwin proposed, he's dead now, proposed evolution by this thing called natural selection. Alright, and natural selection is basically where the environment selects traits that are best suited for that environment, and those that have those traits will be more likely to pass them on to their offspring and stuff like that over time. Alright, so evolution by natural selection has a couple of characteristics to it. All right, so the first one was organisms produce more offspring than can survive. So basically, a bird has like 6 offspring, and the mama bird is hoping that maybe 4 out of the 6 will, make it to adulthood. All right, because evolutionary fitness, like how fit you are, is measured by how many kids you have or how many offspring you have. All right, so the second one is that individuals in a population vary. There's some sort of diversity. All right? So if there's diversity, then the environment is going to select the trait that is most suited for that environment, and then you can, the variation, like I said above, variation has to be inheritable. So when I say inheritable, I mean there has to be some mechanism for you to pass on traits to your children or something like that. And this one is reproduction. All right, and then finally, number 4, the environment selects for individuals or traits that are best suited for that environment. Alright, so Charles Darwin is coming up with his whole theory of evolution by natural selection, and at the exact same time, this other guy, his name is Alfred Wallace, sorry. Alfred Wallace came up with the same theory in the South Pacific, and he gets no credit for it because Charles Darwin beats him to the punch. So, frown face, no credit. Alright, so it's very interesting that 2 different people came up with the same idea at the same time for a mechanism by which organisms or individuals, populations, they change over time. Alright, so we've got Charles Darwin, we've got Alfred Wallace, he didn't get any credit. Alright, so let's talk about the different types of selection. Alright, so let's say that we have some trait. Let's see, let's call this, let me change colors. Let's do this in green. Alright, so types of selection. Alright, so let's say that this graph here represents, it's a normal distribution curve, it looks something like that. Alright, this here is the average. Okay, so this is some characteristic, and this is the frequency in which it occurs. So this is the average here in the middle. Things that are to the extremes are really not that common. So the average is very common, while things that are along the outskirts are not that common. So let's say that it's height. So probably the average height of people would be 5'6". Alright, but you've also going to have people down here at the bottom who are like 4'8". And then up here at the top, you're also going to have people who are like 7 feet tall. So most people would fall into this range, but there are going to be some outliers who fall on either side of the average. Alright, so the first type of selection that we're going to talk about is this thing called directional selection. Alright, and directional selection is where the average trait is going to get either pushed up or pushed down. So for example, let's say that now the average looks something like this. Alright, where the average has been pushed up compared to over here. Alright, so this is now the average, and this is a frequency, and this is a characteristic along the x-axis. Alright, so let's say that we are in an environment where really, really tall people are selected for. So, for example, maybe there's some form of food where only really tall people can access it, and the really short people are just kind of out of luck. And the really short people are going to die, and they're not going to be able to pass on their genes, so they'll be down here. So eventually, the population will start to skew towards this really tall people over here. All right, you can also have this where it starts to skew downwards, where the average goes down, and maybe for some reason the environment is selecting for, really short people or something like that. So that's the first one, that's directional selection, because the average is getting pushed here, and here it's getting pushed down. So the average is getting pushed either one way or the other. All right, so let's go on and talk about the next type of selection. All right, number 2, directional selection was the first one. Let's talk about stabilizing selection. All right, so again, if we are talking about a trait that has a normal distribution, it looks something like this, normal distribution curve, and mine doesn't look that great, but whatever. All right, and again, this is the frequency, and this is some characteristic. Again, it can be any characteristic. I'm using height because it's easiest to visualize. All right, and this is the average. All right, in stabilizing selection, there's going to be something that is selecting against the extremes. All right, so for example, it originally looked like this over here. It originally looked normally distributed, but now, for some reason, everyone is the average. Okay, so everyone is in the average. So again, this is the frequency of the trait. This is the characteristic. So you can have one of two things happening here. The mean is heavily selected for. And when I say mean, I mean average. So average is heavily selected for, or the extremes are heavily selected against. So there's got to be something that is selecting against here that's pushing this down and pushing this down, which is making everyone in the middle. Okay, so it's making this average, the number of people that are the average, go up. And I know my graph doesn't really make it look like that, but basically the peak should be higher here than this one over here. All right, the next type of selection, some people call it diversifying, some people call it disruptive. So it's disruptive / diversifying selection. And again, if this is the normal distribution, and this is the average trait, this is the frequency, and this is the characteristic. All right, we've got something that's going to kind of look like an M here. All right, so now there's going to be two humps, one here, and then down, and then up in the other side. All right, so what's happening here, again, this is the frequency, and this is the characteristic. All right, so something is selecting against this mean or whatever average you want to call it. All right, and now the two extremes of a trait are really going up. So mean, or the average, is selected against, extremes are selected for. Okay, so let's say that for some reason normal size people or normal like height people are being selected against. You're going to have an increase over here of people who are short and then people who are tall. So now there's basically two extremes that are being selected for. All right. So now that we've talked about that, let's talk about the different types of evolution that we talked about in class. So I'm going to switch to orange. All right, so let's talk about types of evolution. All right, and the first one is what they call coevolution. All right, so coevolution occurs when two species evolve with one another. Alright, so their traits over time, they kind of mirror each other's. So, for example, a frog has a toxin which makes it inedible. Is that the word? Is that the right one? Inedible. But some snakes have a resistance to it. Over time, the toxin will become more concentrated, or it'll change slightly. And snakes will continue evolving resistance. Continue evolving resistance. That's an R. Alright, so it's kind of like the evolutionary arms race, if you will. Okay. Second one is going to be divergent evolution, and no, it has nothing to do with the book series Divergent. Got that question a million times. Alright, so divergent evolution is when two formerly related species become less and less similar over time. And this is usually common whenever you've got some sort of geographic isolation, which I'll talk about here in a second. Alright, and then finally we've got number 3, we've got the convergent evolution. Alright, so this is going to occur when two unrelated species become more similar due to common environmental problems. Like, how can we find food if we can't find any on the ground? We can develop wings and stuff like that. So, bats and birds are this common example. Alright, so the last thing I want to talk about is the two different types of speciation. Alright, so let me choose a different color. Alright, so let's talk about the types of speciation. Alright, so first one is called allopatric speciation. Alright, so allopatric speciation, this is the most common one. It's due to geographic isolation. Alright, so geographic isolation meaning mountain range, a river, you know, continents spread apart. What some people don't realize is that humans can cause geographic isolation. Like if we build a road or something through an animal's habitat, we can split them into two. Building roads, mining, you know, building a house, that kind of thing, construction, that can cause two species to become split apart. And then those two species over time, they become, over time, two different species evolve due to different conditions. Alright, so on one side of the mountain range or one side of the river, you've got a certain type of habitat. And then on the other side, you've got a different type of habitat, and then it's going to start selecting for different things. All right, next one is sympatric speciation. Some people think it reminds them of St. Patrick's Day for some reason. All right, sympatric speciation. This one is going to be due to genetic changes, like polyploidy. All right, and polyploidy is just a fancy name for too many chromosomes, basically. So polyploidy, you have multiple copies of chromosomes. So for example, humans have 2 copies of every chromosome, but then if everyone started having 3 instead of 2, then we wouldn't be able to mate with the people who had 2. So then eventually we'll become a different species. Eventually, new species occurs. And this one is relatively uncommon. Alright, so that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about. Don't forget about the quiz tomorrow. It'll be all multiple choice except for a couple where you have to pick a word from like a drop-down menu. If you have any questions, send me an email. Good luck.